She fixed a billionaire's torn suit for free while strangers laughed at her worn hands. The next morning, black cars lined her street and lawyers knocked on her door. The entire neighborhood thought she was in trouble. They had no idea she was about to change everything. This is the true story of a woman the world ignored until one moment of kindness exposed who we all really are. Stay with me. You need to hear this. Welcome to Reality Stories Hub. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you're watching from. Let me tell you about a woman the world walked past every single day. Her name was Grace Williams, and she lived in a corner of Chicago that most people only drove through on their way to somewhere better. You know the kind of place I'm talking about. The buildings lean a little. The paint peels a little more each year. The streetlights flicker at night like they're tired of watching over forgotten dreams. Grace ran a small alterations shop squeezed between a loud barbershop and a convenience store with bars on the windows. The sign above her door had been blue once, maybe. Now it was more gray than anything, with letters that barely held on after years of harsh winters and humid summers. But Grace kept that shop cleaner than most people keep their homes. Inside, everything had its place. Spools of thread lined the walls in rows, organized by color, even though half of them were faded from sunlight. Her sewing machine sat by the window, old but loyal, humming the same steady rhythm it had hummed for 20 years. The whole place smelled like steam and fabric softener, and something else. Something harder to name. Care, maybe. Or hope that refused to quit. Grace herself was a small woman, barely 5'3", with hands that told stories she never spoke out loud. Her fingers were marked with tiny scars, the kind you earn from decades of needle pricks and close work under dim light. Her back curved slightly, not from weakness, but from years spent bent over hems and seams, fixing what other people threw away. She had deep brown eyes that seemed to look right through you. Not in a scary way, but in a way that made you feel like she understood things about you that you hadn't said. Like she knew about struggle because she'd lived it. Like she knew about loss because she'd held it close and learned to breathe around it. Her life hadn't always been this quiet. There was a time when laughter filled her small apartment above the shop. Her husband, Thomas, used to dance with her in their tiny kitchen while beans simmered on the stove. He had a smile that made hard days feel lighter. But cancer doesn't care about smiles. It took him slowly, painfully, leaving Grace with medical bills that buried her for years. She thought she'd never smile again after Thomas. But then there was her son, David. That boy became her reason for everything. She worked double shifts, took on extra jobs, anything to give him chances she never had. She saved for his college fund $1 at a time. Then one rainy October evening, a driver ran a red light. Just like that, her light went out. The world didn't stop. It never does. People offered condolences for a week, maybe 2. Then life moved on. But Grace stayed stuck in that moment, replaying it over and over, wondering what she could have done differently, knowing there was nothing. Grief is a heavy thing. It doesn't announce itself with thunder. It settles like dust on furniture you can't bear to move. Grace carried hers quietly, stitched into every piece of clothing she mended, folded into the silence of her empty apartment. Her shop became her church. People came with ripped jackets and torn pants, but Grace knew they brought more than that. They brought worry about money, stress about family, shame about things falling apart. She never pried. She just listened with her steady hands and kind eyes, fixing more than fabric. She never turned anyone away for not being able to pay. She understood what it meant to count pennies. She understood pride and how it hurt to ask for help. So she just quietly helped, asking no questions, expecting nothing back. The neighborhood knew her, but they didn't really see her. She was just there, like the fire hydrant on the corner or the bus stop bench. Reliable, invisible, easy to overlook. That's how things were the morning everything changed. Grace woke up like always, made her tea, opened her shop at 7 sharp, swept the floor even though it didn't need sweeping. She arranged the same spools of thread, straightened the same stack of invoices, and sat down at her machine by the window. The street outside was waking up too. The The barbershop next door had its radio playing. The convenience store owner was hosing down the sidewalk. A few people passed by, heading to the bus stop, barely glancing at her shop. Grace didn't expect anything different. She never did. She had no way of knowing that across the city, in a glass tower that touched the clouds, something was about to go wrong for someone very important. Someone who had everything except the one thing he was about to desperately need. She had no way of knowing that in a few hours, their two worlds would collide on the sidewalk outside her shop, in front of a crowd that would whisper and judge and laugh. She had no way of knowing that her simple act of kindness would pull back a curtain and show the world something it had forgotten how to see. Grace just sat there, threading her needle, waiting for the day to unfold. Sometimes the most important moments of your life start just like that. Quiet. Ordinary. With no warning at all. His name was Jonathan Pierce, and he was the kind of man people wrote articles about. Not the puff pieces that make you feel good. The serious ones. The kind that talk about billions and boardrooms and decisions that affect thousands of lives. Jonathan owned the largest tech company in the Midwest, the type that everyone's heard of even if they don't quite know what it does. Data systems. Cloud infrastructure. Things that sound complicated because they are. He lived in a penthouse that overlooked Lake Michigan. He wore suits that cost more than most people's cars. He had meetings in Tokyo and London and Dubai, flying between them like normal people switch between grocery stores. But on this particular Tuesday morning, Jonathan Pierce was running late. His driver had called in sick. Traffic was worse than usual. And he had a presentation in exactly 43 minutes that could make or break a deal worth $200 million. Investors were flying in from 3 different countries just to hear him speak. The pressure sat on his chest like a weight. He decided to walk the last 4 blocks. Faster than sitting in gridlock. His assistant was on the phone, his other phone buzzed with messages, and his mind raced through slides and talking points. He didn't see the jagged edge of the delivery truck's door handle, but he felt it when his shoulder caught, and his suit jacket ripped with a sound that made people turn and look. Jonathan stopped dead on the sidewalk. The tear ran from his shoulder down to his elbow, a gaping wound in the expensive Italian fabric. The white shirt underneath showed through, making it impossible to hide. People were staring. Some he recognized from business events. Others were strangers with phones already out, probably posting to social media. In his world, moments like this became memes. Jokes. Evidence that even the powerful stumble. His assistant went pale. "Sir, we can call the meeting reschedule." "No." Jonathan's jaw tightened. This deal had taken 18 months to arrange. Investors don't reschedule because of wardrobe problems. They take it as a sign of weakness, poor planning, lack of control. But what could he do? The meeting was 12 minutes away. Every store nearby was too far or wouldn't open for another hour. That's when he heard a voice. "Excuse me, sir. I can fix that for you." The voice was quiet but steady. Jonathan turned and saw a small black woman standing a few feet away. She wore a simple cotton dress and an apron with faded stains. Her hair was pulled back, showing a face lined with age and weather. She held a small sewing kit in her scarred hands. For a second, Jonathan just stared. Who was this woman? What was she doing? "I have a shop right here," she continued, pointing to the narrow storefront behind her. The cracked sign read Grace's Alterations, in letters that had seen better decades. "I can repair your jacket. Won't take long." Someone in the small crowd that had gathered laughed. Not loudly, but enough for everyone to hear. A man in a business suit smirked and whispered something to his colleague. A woman in yoga clothes looked Grace up and down with the kind of expression that said, "Really?" Jonathan felt the judgment, not directed at him, but at her. At this woman brave enough or foolish enough to approach a man like him and offer help from a place like that. His first instinct was to decline. Politely but firmly. What could she possibly do that would meet his standards? This was a $15,000 suit. You didn't trust that to some random shop with a broken sign. But time was bleeding away, and something in her eyes stopped him from dismissing her outright. There was no begging there. No desperation. Just calm certainty, like she knew exactly what she was offering and wasn't afraid of his answer. How long? He asked. 15 minutes, Grace said. Maybe less. His assistant looked horrified. But Jonathan made calculations in his head. Risk versus reward. Pride versus pragmatism.
Fine, he said.
Grace nodded once and turned toward her shop. Jonathan followed, very aware of the eyes tracking his every step. The whispers that followed him. The phones recording. Inside, the shop was nothing like his world. It was cramped and old and smelled like steam. But it was also spotless. Organized. Everything in its place with the kind of care that only comes from respect for the work. Grace gestured to a chair. You can sit or stand, whichever you're comfortable with. Jonathan stood. He watched as she examined the tear with the focus of a surgeon studying an incision. Her fingers traced the damage, testing the fabric, planning her approach. Then she began to work. Her hands moved with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. The needle flashed in and out, pulling thread through fabric with absolute precision. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Just skill built over decades, muscle memory that didn't need conscious thought. Jonathan found himself watching her hands instead of checking his phone. The scars on her fingers. The slight tremor that came from years of repetitive motion. The way she held the fabric with such gentleness, like it mattered, like it was worth saving. 12 minutes later, Grace stepped back. Done. Jonathan looked down at his shoulder. The tear had vanished. Completely. The repair was so seamless he couldn't even tell where the damage had been. It was better than invisible. It was perfect. He reached for his wallet. How much? Grace shook her head. No charge. I insist. No need, she said quietly. Some things don't require payment. Jonathan stood there, wallet in hand, completely thrown off balance. In his world, everything had a price. Everything was a transaction. But this woman was refusing his money like it meant nothing to her. It was the most unsettling thing that had happened to him in years. Jonathan made it to his meeting with 3 minutes to spare. The presentation went flawlessly. The investors asked sharp questions, and he had sharper answers. By the time he shook hands and smiled for the cameras, the deal was done. $200 million secured. His company's stock would jump tomorrow morning. Business magazines would call it a brilliant move. But Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about the repair. Back in his office, high above the city in a building made of steel and glass, he took off his jacket and studied it under the light. No thread showed. No seam broke the flow of the fabric. The work was invisible, which meant it was masterful. He'd paid thousands for alterations before. Designer tailors in New York who made appointments months in advance. Craftsmen who bragged about their celebrity clients. None of them had worked with more care than that woman in the tiny shop with the broken sign. And she'd refused his money.
Why?
The question bothered him more than it should have. Jonathan was a man who understood motivation. You offered something because you wanted something in return. Money, connections, favors. That was how the world worked. But Grace Williams had wanted nothing. He called his assistant. That shop where I got my jacket fixed this morning. Find out everything about it. By evening, he had a file on his desk. Grace Williams, age 62. Widowed. One son, deceased. Shop owner for 23 years. No major debts, but no savings either. Modest income barely covering expenses. No social media presence. No complaints filed against her business. No lawsuits. Nothing remarkable except a long, quiet history of just existing. Jonathan read it twice. Then he sat back in his chair and stared out at the city lights spreading below him like fallen stars. He'd built his empire from almost nothing. His father had been a factory worker who drank too much. His mother cleaned office buildings at night. Jonathan grew up in a neighborhood not unlike the one where Grace had her shop. He remembered the sound of sirens at night, the smell of old carpet and boiled vegetables, the shame of wearing second-hand clothes to school. He'd fought his way out. Scholarships, student loans, 80-hour work weeks. He'd climbed and climbed until he was so high up that he'd forgotten what the ground looked like. Somewhere along the way, He'd started measuring people by what they could do for him, what they were worth, what they could offer. Grace had offered him something priceless and asked for nothing. The realization hit him like cold water. When was the last time someone had done something for him without wanting something back? When was the last time he'd done something for someone without calculating the return? He couldn't remember. That night, Jonathan barely slept. He kept seeing Grace's hands, scarred and steady, treating his expensive suit like it mattered. Not because of what it cost, but because fixing things was what she did. Because care was who she was. The next morning, he made a decision. I want to do something for her, he told his assistant. The woman who fixed my jacket. Set up a meeting. His assistant hesitated. Sir, what kind of meeting? Are you planning to? Just set it up. Tomorrow, if possible. What happened next would become the talk of that neighborhood for years to come. The black cars arrived just after Grace opened her shop. 3 of them, sleek and expensive, parking along the curb like a presidential motorcade. The car doors opened and men in dark suits stepped out. Not just any men. Lawyers. The kind with briefcases that cost more than monthly rent. The street went quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The barber came out of his shop, clippers still in hand. The convenience store owner stood in his doorway, watching. People on their way to work slowed down, pulled out their phones. Fear moves faster than facts in neighborhoods like this. Black cars and lawyers meant trouble. Eviction. Lawsuits. Government inspections. Something bad. Grace saw them through her window. Her heart jumped, but her face stayed calm. She'd learned a long time ago that panic never helped anything. She wiped her hands on her apron, smoothed her dress, and stepped outside. The lead lawyer approached her with careful respect. Ms. Williams. Yes. My name is David Chen. I represent Mr. Jonathan Pierce. He would like to speak with you if you're willing. The crowd pressed closer, trying to hear. Grace felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their assumptions. She knew what they were thinking. What had she done? Why were these people here? About what? She asked. He'd prefer to explain in person. He's asked us to escort you to his office, at your convenience. Grace looked at the cars, then at her shop, then at the faces watching her. She could refuse. She could close her door and pretend this wasn't happening. But she'd spent her whole life being invisible. And something told her this moment mattered in ways she couldn't yet see. Give me a minute to lock up, she said. The neighborhood watched as Grace Williams, the seamstress they barely noticed, climbed into a car worth more than her entire building. They watched as the motorcade pulled away, leaving questions hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. Inside the car, Grace sat with her hands folded in her lap. The leather seats were softer than anything she'd ever touched. The air conditioning hummed quietly. The lawyer said nothing, just typed on his phone. Grace looked out the window as the city changed around her. The buildings got taller. The streets got cleaner. The people got better dressed. She was traveling through worlds that existed side by side but never really touched. And in her chest, beneath her ribs, something old and scared whispered that this was a mistake. That people like Jonathan Pierce didn't bring people like her into their world without a reason. That kindness from the powerful always came with strings attached. But Grace had learned something else too, something harder one. Sometimes you have to walk toward the unknown with your head up, even when your hands shake. Jonathan's office took up the entire top floor of the Pierce Technologies building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of the lake and the city spreading out like a map. The furniture was minimal but expensive. Everything was white and chrome and glass, designed to impress, designed to intimidate. Grace stood in the center of it all, small and out of place in her cotton dress and worn shoes, but her spine was straight. Jonathan walked in and dismissed the lawyers with a gesture. He wanted this conversation to be just the 2 of them. Ms. Williams, he said, thank you for coming. You sent lawyers, Grace said simply. Didn't feel like much of a choice. A flicker of something crossed Jonathan's face. Surprise, maybe. Most people didn't speak to him that directly. You could have refused. Could have. Grace met his eyes. But I figured you went through a lot of trouble. Seemed polite to hear you out. Jonathan gestured to a chair. Grace sat. He sat across from her, not behind his massive desk. It was a small choice, but deliberate. "I want to explain why I asked you here," he began. "Yesterday, you did something for me. You fixed my jacket when I needed help and you refused payment. Do you remember?" "Of course I remember. Was yesterday." "Why did you refuse the money?" Grace was quiet for a moment. "Didn't feel right to charge you. You needed help. I could give it. That's all. Most people would have charged me double because they knew I'd pay. I'm not most people." Jonathan leaned forward.
No.
"You're not. And that's exactly why I wanted to talk to you." He told her about his presentation, about the deal he'd secured, about how her simple act of kindness had stayed with him, disturbing his sleep, making him question things he'd stopped questioning years ago. "I grew up poor," he said, and Grace heard truth in his voice. "Not far from where your shop is, actually. I spent my whole life climbing away from that, building something, proving I was worth more than where I started." "Nothing wrong with that," Grace said.
No.
"But somewhere along the way, I started measuring everyone by what they could give me, how they could be useful. I stopped seeing people and started seeing transactions." Grace listened without interrupting. She knew how to hold space for truth. "You reminded me of something I'd forgotten," Jonathan continued. "That value isn't just about money. That dignity matters. That sometimes the most important thing you can do is help someone without counting the cost." He paused, then pushed an envelope across the table. "So, I want to help you. There's a check in there. Enough to pay off any debts, repair your shop, maybe even retire if you want." Grace looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "That's generous. But I don't need your money, Mr. Pierce." Jonathan blinked. He'd expected gratitude, maybe tears. Not refusal. "Ms. Williams, I saw your financials. You investigated me?" Grace's voice didn't rise, but it sharpened. "I wanted to understand who you were. And did reading numbers on paper tell you who I am?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Jonathan sat back, genuinely thrown. I'm trying to do something good here." "Are you?" Grace asked. "Or are you trying to make yourself feel better about how you've been living?" The words should have felt like an attack. Instead, they felt like surgery. Precise. Necessary. Painful. "Maybe both," Jonathan admitted quietly. Grace's expression softened slightly. "I appreciate what you're trying to do. I do. But a check doesn't fix what's broken in my neighborhood. It doesn't help the other seamstresses and barbers and shop owners who work just as hard as I do and still can't make ends meet." "Then what would help?" "Opportunity," Grace said. "Training. Support that builds up instead of just hands out. Something that lasts after your guilt fades, and you move on to the next thing." Jonathan was silent, thinking. Then, what if we did that? What if I funded a program? Training for people in your community. Equipment. Resources. But you'd run it. You decide who gets helped and how. Grace studied him. "Why me?" "Because you understand what's actually needed. Because you've lived it. Because you'll do it right." "And what do you get out of it?" "Honestly," Jonathan smiled, but it was sad. "Maybe a chance to remember who I was before I became who I am." Grace was quiet for a long time. She thought about her grandmother, who used to say that the powerful rarely share power. They just rearrange the furniture. She thought about all the promises she'd seen broken in her lifetime. But she also thought about the young people in her neighborhood who had talent but no path. The single mothers working 3 jobs. The kids who needed to see that opportunity was real. "I have conditions," Grace said finally. "Name them." "Nobody gets turned away for being poor. Nobody gets treated as less than. And my shop stays my shop. I'm not selling it. I'm not giving up what I built." "Agreed. And this isn't about making you look good in the news. This is about actually helping people." "Agreed." Grace took a breath. "Then yes, let's do it." Jonathan extended his hand. Grace shook it. Her grip was firm despite the scars, despite the arthritis she never mentioned. In that moment, in that glass tower above the city, 2 people from different worlds made a promise to each other. One of them would keep it. Both of them would be changed by it. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Real change never does. It started small. Jonathan's company funded the purchase of new equipment for Grace's shop. Not just for her, but machines she could use to train others. Industrial sewing equipment, embroidery machines, tools that small businesses could never afford on their own. Grace put out the word in her neighborhood. Anyone who wanted to learn was welcome. No cost. No requirements except the willingness to work hard and treat the craft with respect. The first week, 3 people showed up. One was a young mother named Keisha who needed skills to support her kids. Another was an older man, Raymond, who'd lost his factory job and his confidence. The third was a teenager named Tailor who was trying to stay off the streets. Grace taught them the same way she did everything else. With patience. With care. With the understanding that people carried burdens she couldn't see. She showed them how to thread a needle, how to read fabric, how to measure twice and cut once. But she taught them more than technique. She taught them that their work mattered. That fixing things, creating things was honorable. That their hands could build futures. Word spread. More people came. The shop that had been empty most days was suddenly full of life. The sound of sewing machines hummed like a heartbeat. People who'd been invisible started to see themselves differently. Jonathan visited once, quietly, standing in the back. He watched Grace correct a young woman stitching, her scarred hands gentle but firm. He watched the concentration on faces that had probably spent years being told they didn't matter. And he understood, maybe for the first time in decades, what wealth actually meant. Not the numbers in his account, but this. The ability to open doors that had been locked. To give people a chance to write their own stories. The neighborhood noticed too. The mockery from that first day, the whispers and cruel laughter, faded into something else. Respect. Curiosity. Pride, even. The barbershop owner started sending customers Grace's way when they needed alterations. The convenience store kept a flyer for her program by the register. People who used to walk past her shop now stopped to look in the windows, to see the transformation happening inside. 3 months in, Keisha finished her first commission piece, a wedding dress for a bride who couldn't afford department store prices. When the bride came for her fitting and cried at her reflection, Keisha cried too. Raymond opened his own small alteration business 2 blocks away. He and Grace weren't competitors. They referred customers to each other, helped each other with big orders, proved that abundance wasn't a myth. Tailor, the teenager, stayed off the streets. He found something he was good at, something that gave him purpose. His probation officer called Grace to say whatever she was doing, it was working. But the biggest change wasn't in the shop. It was in how people saw themselves. They walked taller. They spoke with more confidence. They stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. A reporter caught wind of the story and wanted to do a feature. Jonathan agreed to an interview but insisted the focus stay on Grace and her students, not on him. When the reporter asked him why he'd funded the program, Jonathan thought for a long moment. Then he said something that got quoted in newspapers across the country. Wealth can open doors, but it's character that decides who deserves to walk through them. I've spent my life chasing success. Ms. Williams taught me the difference between success and significance. He never mentioned Grace by name in the interview, respecting her preference for privacy. But those who knew, knew. Grace continued her work. The rhythm of her days both changed and unchanged. She still woke early, still made her tea, still opened her shop and sat by the window with her old sewing machine humming beside her. But now there were voices in the back room. Laughter. Questions. The sound of people building something together. She thought sometimes about Thomas, about David, about all the loss she'd carried. The grief was still there. It would always be there. But it had shifted somehow, made room for something else. Not happiness, exactly. Purpose, maybe. The knowledge that her pain hadn't been wasted. That she'd turned it into something that helped others. One afternoon, a young journalist came by, a college student doing a story for her school paper. She asked Grace what the secret was. How she'd changed so many lives. Grace looked up from her work, needle paused mid-stitch. I didn't change anything, she said. I just refused to let the world make me small. Refused to let hardship make me hard. Refused to believe that because I had nothing, I was nothing. But what about when people laughed at you? The student asked. When they mocked you for helping Mr. Pierce? Grace smiled, the lines around her eyes deepening. Silence protects what noise cannot. I knew who I was. Didn't need their permission to help someone. The student scribbled notes. Do you have any advice for people who want to make a difference but feel powerless? Grace set down her work and looked directly at the young woman. Power isn't about how loud you are or how much money you have. It's about standing firm when the world tries to move you. It's about doing the right thing even when no one's watching, especially when no one's watching. She picked up her needle again. Change doesn't always come with trumpets and applause. Sometimes it comes quiet, one stitch at a time. One person helped, one moment of kindness that ripples out further than you'll ever know. The student left with her story. Grace went back to her work. Outside, the street hummed with its usual chaos. Cars honked. People rushed by. The world kept spinning like it always did. But in that small shop with the cracked sign, something had shifted. A woman who'd been invisible had reminded everyone who stopped to look that dignity can't be bought or sold. That character matters more than status. That the quietest voices sometimes carry the most powerful truths. And in offices and apartments and street corners across the city, people who'd heard her story started to ask themselves a question they'd forgotten to ask. What kind of person do I want to be? Not what do I want to have? Not what do I want to achieve? But who do I want to be when no one's keeping score? Grace never became famous. She never wanted to be. She just kept doing what she'd always done, fixing what was broken, helping where she could, treating every person who walked through her door with the dignity they deserved. And in a world that often mistakes noise for importance, that was more than enough. That was everything. If this story touched your heart, share where you're watching from and what quiet strength means to you. Subscribe for more stories that honor dignity, resilience, and the heroes the world almost overlooked.